We did a lot of the show with marionettes and hand puppets, and we do kind of both kinds of puppets.
In 1982, Jim Henson built a puppet so disturbing, he couldn't bring himself to touch it. The creation was meant for the Dark Crystal, but something went wrong during the design process. Jim spent weeks perfecting every horrifying detail. Then he stopped. He handed it to his assistant and walked away. The puppet sat in storage for years. Jim would visit the workshop, but never went near it. His family later found notes explaining why he was afraid. What he discovered about this puppet changed everything he believed about his own creations. Jim Henson was born on September 24, 1936, in Greenville, Mississippi. His parents were Paul Ransom Henson and Betty Marcella Brown. His father worked for the government as an agronomist, and his mother came from a creative family. Jim grew up in a small town called Leland. It was quiet and full of nature. He spent a lot of time watching animals, listening to stories, and imagining new characters. His grandmother was always creating things with her hands, painting, quilting, and sewing, and she passed that creative spirit down to him. Those early days in Mississippi shaped how Jim would later bring puppets to life in a way no one had ever seen before. When Jim was around 11, his family moved to Hyattsville, Maryland, close to Washington, D.C. That move changed everything. One day, they brought home their first television set, and Jim later said it was the biggest moment of his childhood. This new world of moving pictures opened his mind to new ideas. He started dreaming about how puppets could work on screen, not just on a stage. Even though his family followed Christian Science, which shaped how he looked at life, the idea that he refused medical treatment because of his faith isn't true. That story was just a rumor. Moving from the slow pace of Mississippi to the busy suburbs of Maryland also brought new chances. Jim now lived near studios and got closer to the world of television. Jim didn't wait for things to happen. Around the age of 10, he started building his own puppets using whatever he could find. One of his first characters, which later became the early version of Kermit the Frog, was made with parts of a green coat from his mother, 2 halves of a ping-pong ball for eyes, and denim for the sleeve. He didn't use the old wooden style. Instead, he built soft, flexible puppets that could move and show real emotions. He believed a puppet should reflect what a hand can do, and that changed everything. While Jim was still young, he became fascinated with Edgar Bergen, the ventriloquist who worked with dummies like Charlie McCarthy. Bergen's puppets weren't perfect. He moved his lips, but people still believed the characters were real. Jim loved that. He saw how the audience would talk to the puppet like it was a real person and completely forget about the puppeteer. That idea stuck with him. When Edgar Bergen passed away in 1978, Jim spoke at his funeral. He even dedicated the Muppet movie to him. Later, the Bergen family sent Jim a photo that said, "Dear Jim, keep the magic alive." During high school in Maryland, Jim started performing puppets on a local TV show. That was in 1954. He was still just a teenager when he first appeared on television. He didn't use the old setup with stiff puppets on a fixed stage. Instead, he started trying new camera angles and techniques that brought his characters to life in a new way. He looked up to TV puppeteers like Burr Tillstrom and Bill and Cora Baird. In 1955, during his first year at the University of Maryland, Jim got hired by WRC-TV to create a short puppet show called Sam and Friends. It aired twice every night, and just 3 years later, in 1958, he won his first Emmy Award at the age of 21. Jim started college in 1954, thinking he might become a commercial artist. He chose studio art as his major, but he later made a surprising decision. He graduated in 1960 with a degree in home economics. That wasn't common for men at the time, but Jim had a reason. He wanted access to the university's best tools for set and costume design. As a freshman, he even joined a senior puppetry class, where he met Jane Niebel. She would become his creative partner and wife. People who saw him in that class said Jim already seemed like someone who wanted to change the world. In 1954, Jim made his TV debut with a character called Pierre the French Rat. It was on a local show called the Junior Morning Show. Pierre had a rough look, made from plastic wood and old materials. Viewers were shocked by how strange and different it looked. But the show only lasted 3 weeks. The station shut it down because some of the puppeteers, including Jim, were under 14, and it violated labor laws. Still, Pierre became one of Jim's earliest puppets, and later showed up on Sam and Friends. In 1965, Jim started an animated short film called Alexander the Grape. He worked on it on his 29th birthday, September 24th. He used cutout paper shapes and animated them by hand, frame by frame. He even hired a professional composer to make the music. But Jim never finished the film. He kept trying to make it perfect, and eventually moved on to other things. The footage stayed hidden for decades until it was found in 2009 and pieced together by the Jim Henson Company. It gave fans a glimpse of how serious and creative he was, even in his early years. Back in 1955, Jim's big break came with Sam and Friends. The show ran until 1961 and aired just before the evening news and late-night talk shows. That gave it a huge audience. One of the most memorable things was the early version of Kermit. He made it with his mother's old coat, ping-pong balls, and a cardboard mouth. The show didn't just entertain, it changed puppetry. Jim even watched the performance live on a monitor while filming, something no one had done before. It earned him his first Emmy in 1958, when he was only 21. In 1956, Jim did something that scared everyone around him. He temporarily dropped out of college to focus full-time on puppetry. Sam and Friends had become so popular that the station gave them 2 evening slots, and they had to make 10 episodes a week. Jim's friends and family thought it was risky. There was no promise of a stable job, but Jim believed in what he was doing. That October, he and Jane appeared on The Tonight Show with Steve Allen, and the whole country noticed. That one moment opened the door to more work, more money, and real respect in the TV world. By 1958, he had already proven everyone wrong. In October 1957, Jim and Jane were hired to make ads for Wilkins Coffee. They created 2 puppet characters, Wilkins, who loved coffee, and Wantkins, who didn't. There's a myth that Jim never performed Wantkins because of the violence in the ads, but that's false. Jim performed both. The first Wilkins puppet was made from brown flannel, with button eyes and a painted mouth. In 1959, they were awarded official patents for both puppets. Between 1957 and 1961, they made 179 ads. Each one lasted only 8 seconds and ended with Wantkins getting violently punished for refusing to drink Wilkins coffee. He got shot, exploded, electrocuted, thrown from buildings, and even tied to electric chairs. These short ads ran in the tiniest time slots, just enough to shock people, make them laugh, and leave a mark. Wilkins Coffee became the talk of Washington. Sales skyrocketed. Jim personally directed the violent scenes. He didn't hold back. One ad showed Wilkins fencing and wiping blood off his sword after stabbing Wantkins. Another showed Wantkins paying more for lunch just because he didn't drink coffee. Some people complained, calling the ads too violent. In response, Jim made a parody ad where Wantkins joins a fake anti-violence league. But no matter what critics said, the ads were never banned. They worked too well. Jim later explained that ads didn't always need a hard sell. Sometimes humor and shock could do more. Other companies started calling. By 1958, Jim was making versions of the violent ads for different brands across the country. La Touraine Coffee, Nash's Coffee, Red Diamond, Community Coffee, and even companies like Standard Oil wanted in. He reused the same scripts, just changing the names. This brought in real money and let Jim chase his bigger dreams. That same year, he sold 25,000 puppets for $1 each, his first real taste of merchandise success. The idea that Jim hated violence is wrong. In fact, he used Watkins to test darker comedy aimed at adults. This wasn't just about coffee. It was Jim testing whether puppets could work outside of children's shows. Jane performed both characters too, before leaving the puppet world in 1963 to raise their kids. Jim was already imagining a world where puppets could be silly, smart, and a little dangerous all at once. His later shows, like The Muppet Show, grew from these early experiments. His biographer, Brian J. Jones, later wrote that Jim had already created the kind of lovable characters that let him get away with pushing the limits. In 1958, on November 20th, Jim and Jane Henson officially started something they called Muppets, Inc. Just 3 years earlier, their little local show, Sam and Friends, had aired on WRC-TV in Washington, D.C. Jim had come up with the word Muppet by mixing marionette and puppet, not knowing that one day it would become a trademark owned by Disney. But what no one expected was how fast things moved. By 1956, even before founding the company, the Muppets were already on national TV through The Steve Allen Show. Then in 1958, Sam and Friends won an Emmy. The first true star was Roleaf the dog, who first appeared in Purina Dog Chow commercials and then became a regular on The Jimmy Dean Show from 1963 to 1966. Jimmy Dean was even offered 40% of the company, but he didn't think he had the right to accept. That one decision cost him millions. In 1969, everything changed again. Joan Gans Cooney from the Children's Television Workshop asked Jim to work on a new kind of show for kids. That show became Sesame Street, which aired for the first time on November 10, 1969. Jim created Big Bird, Oscar the Grouch, Grover, and Cookie Monster for it. But the show caused controversy. In May 1970, Mississippi banned it because it had children of different races playing together. They said the state wasn't ready. The show was praised by critics, but attacked by some conservatives. Even so, it won 20 awards in its first year, including 3 Emmys and a Peabody. The show was a revolution, but behind the scenes, Jim was close to quitting. In 1970, just 1 year after Sesame Street began, he was tired of the constant creative fights. He almost walked away, risking everything. If he had, the show might have failed. But he stayed. It was the right choice. By 2001, Sesame Street was being watched by over 120 million kids around the world. By 2006, there were 20 different international versions. By 2009, it aired in more than 140 countries. Jim stopped doing commercials entirely and said he was glad to be done with them. Also in 1969, 2 characters named Bert and Ernie were introduced in the very first episode of Sesame Street. They were based on the Odd Couple characters, but interestingly, Bert and Ernie came before the TV version of The Odd Couple aired. Jim based their relationship on real-life friendships. In the 1980s, writer Mark Saltzman said he imagined Bert and Ernie as a couple when writing their scenes, as a quiet way of showing LGBTQ+ representation. This created huge debates in the 1990s and beyond. Some people loved the idea. Others accused the show of pushing a gay agenda. The debate still goes on. In that first season, Jim Henson also made short films about numbers that kids still remember today. One had a baker falling downstairs while holding pies. He also made clips like King of 8, Queen of 6, 11 Cheer, and C is for Cookie. These weren't just fun. They used brand-new puppetry methods with foam and fabric. No one had seen anything like it. In 1970, Jim won an Emmy for it. These shorts helped turn learning into something kids loved. In the mid-1970s, Jim wanted to do something different. He tried launching a variety show with puppets, but every U.S. network rejected it. First, ABC aired The Muppets Valentine Show in January 1974, but it didn't do well. Then, in 1975, Jim made a second pilot called The Muppet Show, Sex and Violence. The name shocked people, and ABC said no. He pitched a third time, with clips showing stars like Julie Andrews and Cher, but CBS also said no. It was humiliating. That's when British producer Lou Grade said yes. He let Jim make the show in England at ATV Elstree Studios. That decision changed everything. On September 5, 1976, The Muppet Show aired with guest star Joel Grey. Within 3 years, by 1979, it was on in over 100 countries and watched by 235 million people. Every episode cost $130,000 to make, making it one of the most expensive puppet shows ever. Celebrities like Elton John and Rita Moreno lined up to appear. The show ran for 5 seasons and ended on March 15, 1981, with 120 episodes. But the success came at a price. Jim's schedule was brutal. He voiced Kermit, directed scenes, managed scripts, and helped fix puppets after filming. By 1978, the stress became too much. He almost collapsed during one shoot. Frank Oz had to step in and direct. At the same time, Jim started working on The Muppet Movie, which began filming on July 5, 1978. He was burning out. That pressure would later cost him his life. In 1990, Jim died from a bacterial infection. He was only 53. Doctors said it might have been survivable if he hadn't ignored his symptoms. One of the most shocking Muppet characters was Miss Piggy. She wasn't even planned. She was thrown together in just 30 minutes when Herb Alpert needed a glamorous pig for his special. Bonnie Erickson quickly made her using leftover parts, giving her big eyes, satin, and pearls. Frank Oz gave her a strong and wild personality, part truck driver, part diva. In 1976, viewers were stunned when she karate chopped Kermit and screamed, "Hi-ya!" She was inspired by Peggy Lee and showed that female characters could be bold and aggressive. Some people saw her as the first feminist pig on TV. In 1981, The Muppet Show finally got major recognition. It won awards for writing and was nominated for Best Variety Program. But some episodes caused controversy. A Johnny Cash episode showed a Confederate flag and later needed warnings. Another episode with Peter Sellers had adult jokes. Some were banned or edited later. But the show still proved that puppets could be smart, funny, and meaningful, even for adults. Then came The Muppet Movie in 1979. Jim directed it himself. It had stars like Bob Hope, Steve Martin, Mel Brooks, and Orson Welles. The most talked about scene was Kermit riding a bike. To pull it off, Jim had to hide inside a special container below the bike and control everything from there. It was groundbreaking. The film made over $65 million and got 2 Oscar nominations, including one for Rainbow Connection. It showed that puppets could lead a big movie, but Jim wanted to go darker. In 1982, he made The Dark Crystal, a fantasy film with no humans. It had scary scenes with puppet deaths and occult themes that shocked parents. It cost $15 million to make and earned $40 million. But the dark tone made people uncomfortable. It almost bankrupted the company. Critics didn't understand it. Jim had gone too far for some fans, and it made him question everything. Then, in 1986, he made Labyrinth, starring David Bowie. Jim spent $25 million of his own money. It opened the same summer as Top Gun and Ferris Bueller. It flopped in theaters, making just $12.9 million in the US. Jim was crushed and never directed a film again. His son Brian said the critics destroyed his father's confidence. But Labyrinth became a cult classic later, earning millions from merchandise. In 1983, Jim made Fraggle Rock, hoping to spread peace and understanding during the Cold War. He chose to film it in Canada to avoid US censorship. The show aired in 90 countries and 13 languages. In January 1989, it became the first North American show to air in the Soviet Union. Jim had visited Russia before and admired their puppet artists. Some of his staff joked that Fraggle Rock helped end the Cold War. In 1987, Jim released something even darker, The Storyteller. Hosted by John Hurt, the show used folklore to tell scary, emotional stories. One tale had young boys turn into ravens with painful body changes. Another showed a soldier trapped in death's world forever. The show was never aired in full in the US because it was too intense. But Jim believed kids needed fear sometimes. He thought children were strong enough to handle stories with real pain and mystery. This was the final step in his journey away from safe family TV. In August 1989, something big was about to happen. Jim Henson, the man behind the Muppets, had just announced a $150 million deal with Disney. He said working with Disney would create a wonderful force. It was supposed to give him full creative control. Movies, TV shows, even theme park rides. But behind the smiles, something darker was brewing. Less than a year later, on May 16, 1990, Jim Henson died suddenly from pneumonia. After that, Disney started backing away. They no longer wanted to pay the $150 million. They said the company wasn't worth that without Jim. His family was heartbroken and furious. They said Disney was trying to steal everything Jim had built. The deal fell apart in December 1990. But Disney kept using the Muppets in shows and ads without permission. They claimed they had some kind of implied license. The Henson family took them to court. It became one of the ugliest fights in Hollywood. Just a year later, on April 26, 1991, something unusual hit TV. A show called Dinosaurs. Jim had come up with the idea back in 1988, but it only came to life after he was gone. The show cost a shocking $90 million and became the most expensive half-hour show ever made. Every single puppet character needed 3 people to control it. Some puppets even fell apart after a few years because the materials were so fragile. But the biggest surprise was the story. Even though it looked like a kids' show, it was filled with dark warnings about pollution and how humans were destroying the planet. The show only lasted until 1994 because it was just too expensive to keep going. Then came another strange battle. In 1997, Henson Productions discovered someone had copied 2 old puppets Jim and Jane Henson created in the late 1950s, Wilkins and Watkins, 2 characters used in coffee commercials when they were still in college. They found unauthorized copies being used without permission. These weren't just old puppets. They were some of the very first Muppet-style characters, created even before Kermit. The lawsuit was shocking. It exposed just how cutthroat the puppet world had become, and how even long-forgotten characters were now worth millions. And back in 1991, Disney opened Muppet Vision 3D on May 16th, exactly 1 year after Jim died. It became a massive theme park attraction using live effects, 3D films, smoke, bubbles, and advanced animatronics. It was also the last major project Jim ever directed. He had been working non-stop, juggling this attraction, the Disney deal, and developing Dinosaurs. But all that work came at a price. Jim was completely exhausted. His health was quietly failing, and no one realized it. The very success of the Muppet Vision project became a haunting symbol. It masked the exhaustion that may have helped lead to his death. The ride ran for 34 years, finally closing on June 8, 2025. In his final year, Jim started pushing the Muppets in a totally different direction. In 1990, he pitched shows for adults, edgy, risky, and nothing like the family-friendly Muppets the world knew. He wanted to bring puppets to Saturday Night Live and other mature shows. This wasn't the first time he tried something wild. In 1975, he made a pilot called Sex and Violence, which even confused his own daughter, Lisa, who asked, "Where's the sex?" Jim laughed it off, but it showed just how far he was willing to go. These new adult projects shocked everyone who saw them. Jim wanted to grow, to break out of the box people put him in. But none of it happened. His death in 1990 ended those plans forever. Jim met Jane Niebel in 1954 at the University of Maryland during a puppetry class. He quickly saw her talent and invited her to work with him. They fell in love and got married on May 28, 1959. They had 5 children: Lisa in 1960, Cheryl in 1961, Brian in 1963, John in 1965, and Heather in 1970. Their home in Bethesda, Maryland, became a workshop full of puppets and fabric scraps. Puppets were built in the basement. It wasn't just a house. It was a factory of imagination. But family life wasn't easy. Jim worked constantly and traveled often. Jane managed the home and kids, while still helping with puppets. They separated in 1986, but stayed close until the end. Cheryl later said that the only way to be around her dad was to work with him. That's how they stayed connected. Many people thought Jim didn't go to the hospital in 1990 because of his Christian Science beliefs, but that wasn't true. He was raised in the faith, but he didn't practice it. What really happened was worse in a way. Jim thought his illness would pass. He didn't want to bother anyone. On May 4, 1990, he appeared on the Arsenio Hall show with a sore throat. By May 12th, while visiting family in North Carolina, he was coughing up blood, but he didn't tell anyone. At 4:00 a.m. on May 15th, he collapsed and was rushed to New York Presbyterian Hospital. The doctors discovered a brutal infection in both lungs. If he had come in just 12 hours earlier, he could have been saved. But by then, the infection had caused toxic shock. His organs began to shut down. On May 16, 1990, at exactly 1:21 a.m., Jim Henson died at age 53. People were shocked. How could something like this happen in the modern world? One of his last words to his son John was, "I'm going to be fine." But he wasn't. Behind the scenes, the Disney deal was falling apart. Frank Oz later said, "The Disney deal probably killed Jim." The pressure was enormous. Jim was also refusing to let Disney buy Sesame Street. After his death, the handshake deal collapsed. By 1991, the Henson family was suing Disney for using the Muppets without permission. They accused them of greed and arrogance. The whole company was stuck in limbo. New projects were frozen for nearly 2 years. Jim's memorial service was held on May 21, 1990 in New York. Another service followed in London on July 2nd. Jim had asked that no one wear black. Big Bird sang "Be in Green" through tears. Thousands attended. But behind the beauty of the ceremony, trouble was brewing. About 55% of the estate went to taxes. The failed Disney deal had drained the company, and the lawsuits made everything worse. For years, creativity was frozen. The most tragic part came after. The autopsy showed that the infection had started much earlier, probably even during that early May Arsenio Hall appearance. The bacteria had been growing quietly inside him. Some people are genetically more vulnerable to this type of infection, and stress can make it worse. Jim had been working too hard for too long. His body couldn't fight anymore. Then came the final twist. In 2004, Disney finally bought the Muppets, but not for $150 million. They paid just $75 million, half the price. People were furious. Critics said it was theft. Fans said Disney ruined the Muppets with endless reboots and cheap spin-offs. Jim had believed Disney would protect his creations. Instead, it felt like everything he built had been sold off for less. In 2024, Ron Howard released a documentary called Jim Henson, Idea Man. It shocked viewers by showing rare footage of Jim's early work. Some scenes were violent. One puppet even shot another in the head during a meat commercial. In another, a monster ate a character alive. Jim later said it was all just part of learning, but it showed that he had always pushed the limits. Since 1982, the Jim Henson Foundation has given over $4.2 million to strange and dark puppet projects. Not for kids, but for adults. They funded shows about death, nightmares, even Mayan myths filled with graphic violence. One play, Symphonie Fantastique, was performed underwater and ran for an entire year in New York. The foundation kept Jim's spirit alive, but not the one the public knew. It showed that Jim Henson had always been more than just the man behind Kermit. He was trying to shake the world with puppets, and in many ways, he still is.